I don't want to just retell the story of Bletchley Park. You may know it already, though. The tale of the codebreakers that cracked the Enigma code in World War II has been told in so many ways with varying degrees of accuracy that I couldn't add anything there. But I do know that the popular myth of a few boffins working into the night, poring over blackboards filled with equations, isn't anywhere near the whole story. You can see from aerial shots, yes, there's the big old country house, and then there's many, many other wartime buildings next to it, the huts and the blocks. There were thousands of people working there. So I have a different question. How on earth did they keep it secret? We will get to the secrecy, I promise. I met a couple of the team at Bletchley Park. They showed me around the old mansion where everything started out, the painstakingly recreated offices. There was one historical inaccuracy that I'm very thankful for. Back in the 40s, everything would have reeked of tobacco. Let's set up the scale of Bletchley Park's problem first. The Allies could intercept some Axis communications, but they're in code. They are seemingly random strings of letters that were passed on to the codebreakers. One of the encryption tools in use is called Enigma. Lily, the learning manager at Bletchley Park, showed me an actual Enigma machine.
It's an electromechanical machine. It's not a computer. It's essentially a very complicated circuit. So it does run on a battery. So we're just going to turn it on. So it's on aus at the moment for off.
Off.
So we're going to turn it on to hell, which is bright. It likes bright lights. And would you like to press a key and see what happens?
On an original Enigma machine. X seems the right letter.
Go for it. That's it. So T has lit up.
And the rotor, the right-hand rotor, turned once.
Absolutely. So one rotor, the one on the right, always turns. The ones in the middle and on the left turn sporadically based on how the machine has been set up. So you'll always see one turn and others move at other times. So if you now press X again, the machine's in a slightly different position because you're going to move that rotor.
A.
Excellent. So we're seeing this is a polyalphabetic cipher machine. You're putting in the same input of X, but you're getting a different output.
No integrated circuit boards, no chips, just wires and connections. Many, many, many wires and connections. Some of them unchanging in the machine, a lot of them adjustable. There was a plug board at the bottom with interchangeable connections, and all those rotors could be swapped around. Can we see inside?
We can, yeah. There we go.
May I? Again?
Yeah.
So I push X again.
Yep.
There are a lot of wires to do the encryption here.
Yeah. So each time it's going through a rotor, it's following a wire from one contact to the other. And it's going to be different each time you press X because at least one rotor is moving. So you've now taken a different position, so you're taking a different route through the machine, hence why a different letter lights up on the lamp board.
Enigma was originally intended for use in banks and private enterprise, but the military took it over in the late 20s. It wasn't secret. Bletchley Park had Enigma machines during the war, older models and captured models. They knew the principles. The trouble was that the cipher was so complicated, and the Axis made modifications, and the settings were changed every day.
They add additional rotors. So originally there was only the 3 rotors in the machine that then could be swapped into 6 different positions, combinations. They added the 2 additional ones for this type of machine, and they also added this plug board. The plug board adds 150 trillion sort of options to the combinations. That's not even the biggest number. If you don't know the settings for the day and they change every 24 hours, there are still 103 sextillion different ways you can set up this machine for any individual message that's going to be enciphered.
Because you change the plug board, you change the rotors, you change the rotor positions.
Yep. And the order of the rotors, all sorts of different things will be set up.
That was the scale of the problem. There were the boffins at Bletchley Park, the mathematicians recruited through old boy networks and recommendations, and famously once a newspaper ad looking for good crossword solvers. Their job wasn't to figure out those settings, it was to figure out the weaknesses in the encryption, in the workings of the machines for whatever encryption systems Germany, Italy or Japan were using.
One of the weaknesses of the Enigma machine is that no letter can be enciphered as itself, which means I can press C as many times as I like and C is never going to appear on the lamp board.
That's... The thing about encryption is that it feels like such a tiny weakness.
Well, it almost feels like a strength. You know, C is never going to be C, but actually, for the codebreakers, if they have an idea of what might appear in a message, the classic example of things like weather report, or a station that was always sending nothing to report every day, because nothing much happened there, But if you've got that word, of course, in German, and you line it up against your ciphertext, you're looking for places where your crib, as we call it, the word for weather report, doesn't line up with any of the letters, because you know then you found a potential location.
And it was just brute force. It was just figure it out, use every clue you have.
Yeah.
But eventually you just have to brute force everything until words come out. Sometimes those clues accidentally came from the people who were using Enigma. They'd repeat settings or take shortcuts. Sometimes it was a hunch or even a lucky guess. But a huge amount of work was basically brute force, lining up cribs, seeing what works and what doesn't. Some of that by humans, some of that by early electronic systems at Bletchley Park, the bomb machines. But that mechanisation required a lot of humans to support it, and those humans had to stay quiet about it.
When the codebreakers first moved here in 1939, there were only about 180 of them, but the organisation grew very rapidly throughout the war, and at peak, which is in January 1945, there were 8,995 people working in the organisation. So, and of those, about 7,500 are on this site. So every day, 3 times a day, because they're on 8-hour rolling shifts, you would have had thousands and thousands of people coming into the site and going off the site again.
That is David, research historian at Bletchley Park, and one of the most qualified people to tell the story of the humans who helped break Enigma and the incredible secrecy required.
Initially, everyone was billeted, as the term went, in Bletchley. Milton Keynes didn't exist, so you just had the town of Bletchley.
So billeted is basically the government comes along and says you need to also house this person?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's in hotels and pubs, but equally commonly they just turn up to a householder and say, do you have a spare room? Can you take somebody? And then they get an extra ration coupon, they get a little bit of money. So basically every spare bedroom in Bletchley had a codebreaker in it.
As the war went on and Bletchley Park expanded, the Army and Air Force built camps behind the park, and the Navy requisitioned nearby country houses like Woburn Abbey, which became dormitories for the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens.
We have a lot of testimony from Wrens who were billeted in Woburn Abbey, for example, and it's a very grand stately home, but the Duke of Bedford basically hid everything of any value in the cellar, panelled over the walls with plywood, turned the heating off and left.
Right.
And then the Navy...
Which I'm laughing about, but that's really... That's not a pleasant place to be.
It was, by all accounts, it was very spooky and very cold. The house is actually a good 1.5 miles, 2 miles from Woburn village. And so every Sunday morning they had to form up in fours and march to church, which, regardless of which shift they'd been on.
Yeah.
So it sounds very glamorous and luxurious, but actually it wasn't.
No, it really is. Like a lot of things, it's not a nice place to be, that, but it's part of the war effort. It's your job.
Exactly.
So how do the armed forces get thousands of people in and out of Bletchley Park every 8 hours?
Driven, or they cycled, walked. Some got the train, because people were billeted as far away as Bedford.
Oh, right.
Well, they had buses, they had cars, they had trucks. Because they didn't officially exist, if you like, because they're a Foreign Office organisation, they had to beg, borrow and steal transport from wherever they could get it.
If the enemy knew about Bletchley Park and what was going on there, it would be close to the top of the list of bombing targets. So all those thousands of people, did they know what the big picture was?
The rule was that you weren't allowed to talk to anybody about what you did outside your immediate team. You know, the hut you were in or the room you were in or whatever. Even if you went to lunch in the canteen, which was over there, you couldn't talk to people from other parts of the organisation about work.
Right.
So it was really extremely compartmentalised. And also, a lot of the code-breaking processes that had been developed to attack, Enigma or Japanese codes or whatever it was, they're quite a complicated process, but that process was broken down into a production line of fairly basic tasks. So a lot of the more junior staff, many of whom were women, would be brought in and they'd be kind of put in a room, and pieces of paper with mysterious stuff on them would come in, and they would do a particular process, and then they'd pass those papers out again. One veteran described it as like doing your homework every night and never getting it marked.
Oh.
Which I think is a wonderful analogy for, yes, they knew what they were doing. Well, they knew literally what they were doing, but what they were doing in the big sense. And, obviously people have had an idea that it was to do with signals intelligence, but if you work on Enigma, for example, you're not going to know anything about Japanese. You might even not even realise they're doing Japanese.
Right, because you're getting characters in, doing a thing to them and getting characters out.
Yes, it's here's some numbers, add these numbers to these numbers, and then put them in this tray. You know.
And by the way, this is vital to the war effort, and you must do it for 8 hours.
Yes,
and you must not
in the
make
middle of the night.
any mathematical errors.
Exactly.
Wow.
Or you must operate this. You must plug up and unplug this machine every 10 minutes. So people have a romantic vision that it must have been so wonderful to work on Bletchley. No, it was probably really boring for most people. And very tiring. I mean, we have paperwork to show that the organisation were very careful in monitoring absentee levels, sickness levels, and that kind of thing. It being the 1940s, they interpret absence in the context of morale.
Oh.
If people are getting sick too often, that's not because they're sick, it's because they're miserable. And they'll get less sick if you cheer them up.
Okay.
So, an example of this was, I told you.
There's always going to be, there's going to be tourists, there's going to be someone with a lawnmower, and there's going to be a school trip going round, and we'll work around it.
One wonderful example is the building we're coming up to, the teleprinter building here. The boss decided the women are getting a bit miserable. So he introduced Music While You Work.
Oh.
They had speakers. I mean, Music While You Work was literally a programme broadcast by the BBC for factories.
It was.
They specially selected music that they thought had rhythms that were compatible with repetitive processes. They put it on, but the machines made the building hot, so they opened the windows. And then Frank Birch, who ran Naval Section in the building that's right next door, complained because he said his code breakers needed to concentrate and all this racket coming from the building next door was unacceptable. So they either had to turn the music off or shut the windows.
Bletchley Park isn't really associated with doing repetitive work, with production lines, building the thingamy-bob that's going to win the war. But it should be. Most of the people there were on a production line, just one that's producing numbers and letters.
Block C, which is now our entrance and cafe, that building had Hollerith punch card machines in it. These are sort of the precursors to computers. They were invented in the late 19th century. And basically you have a card about that size, which has effectively 80 alphabets on it. And you can store 80 characters of information on a card. These continued in use in computing until certainly the 70s and 80s.
Oh, this is the reason why, to this day, 80 characters is the cutoff for certain types of text files. Comes from the old punch cards.
You would put your initial lump of data on cards into one machine, it would do its thing, and you get the output of that machine, and you put it in another machine, and that would do its thing, and you take the output from there and put it in another machine. And Freddie Freeborn, who ran the section, for a particularly complicated Italian job that they were doing, so that the women knew what to do, he drew chalk lines on the floor from the outputs to the inputs. And basically, he's programmed the building. You can think about it in that way. Literally, it's a mechanical and woman-powered computer programmed by chalk on the floor.
Wow.
What this site does is it sucks in data at one end, much of it encrypted, some of it not. It processes that data in all kinds of different ways, decoding it, translating it, indexing it, cataloguing it, whatever, and spitting it out the other end as product, as intelligence, actionable intelligence for government and army and everybody else. And it does that very, very quickly, and for the period, massive bulk.
This was an intelligence factory. So how do you keep that secret with so many people involved? The answer to that is inside the blocks and also after this break. Would you like to change the world? Is an incredible thing for today's sponsor to ask. They're a non-profit called 80,000 Hours, and they're not selling anything. They want to help people find meaningful, fulfilling careers that will do long-term good for the world. What's impressed me the most about them is that since they last sponsored me years ago, their priorities have changed a bit. They've updated their career guides, their website, their podcast, their job board, based on what's happening in the world. They are uncertain about some things, and they tell you when they're uncertain, and all their advice is free forever. I chatted to a couple of their team in person last month, and they seem to be thoughtful, open to feedback, and trying to help everyone. If you want to change the world, if you want to do good with the 80,000 hours in an average working life, they would like to help you figure out how to do that. So if that's something you'd be interested in, and if you're watching a video like this, well, you know what to do. The link is on screen or in the description. You can join their mailing list and get their free career guide, and I'll wish you good luck for the future. So, into the blocks. A museum now, but back then, it was where the codebreakers were working. Now, it was a bit dark and much more enclosed in there, so I swapped cameras, and you'll see me occasionally struggle to find a decent angle. I did my best. David is very tall.
This is the first of 10 massive blocks that were built during what we refer to as the industrial phase of the site, when you have all these many, many thousands of people.
Industrial.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Bletchley Park's famous for huts.
Yes.
But that's really only 39, 40, 41. By 1942, they're starting to move into these much bigger buildings, which are theoretically splinter-proof, which means if a bomb lands outside and you're lying on the floor, you should be all right. They're not completely bomb-proof, but they are pretty robust.
While it's a little difficult to see, the floor changed from red to grey. Red meant a circulation space. People were free to move about there. Grey meant private. If they don't work there, they must not enter.
And that's sort of built into the building design?
These are the original floors. They're built into the building, yes. So all the corridors are red and all the rooms are grey, basically.
And this was all constructed to order?
Yes.
For the park?
For the code-breaking work, yes.
Right.
We've actually knocked these holes through for visitors. All of these would have been individual compartments, basically accessed from the corridor in the centre.
There used to be buildings like that all across the country, but most have been demolished because the country wasn't precious about the hastily constructed wartime stuff. They had cities to rebuild and people to house. The Bletchley Park blocks became a teacher training college, then a school for telephone employees. Alan Turing's office, which is now painstakingly reconstructed from people's memories and testimonies, that was a dormitory for a while, with people having no idea what went on there, because Bletchley Park was still secret for decades. We passed through the plotting room, again, now a museum with interactive exhibits, but this is where maps of the war would have been managed in real time, not just because knowing what the enemy might be talking about could be a code-breaking clue, but also because if you do decrypt a message, you can figure out whether it's low priority or whether there is a submarine directly in the path of a convoy and you need to tell the armed forces about it.
Weirdly, of all the people at Bletchley Park, you say, did people know what they were doing? Did they know how it affected the war? The women in here would have known exactly what was going on because they were pinning it on the wall on a daily basis. But they're really unusual in that respect because most people, they were just putting the paper in the tray and it was disappearing.
Yeah.
So those women are unusual in that they get an insight on the war.
The intelligence factory's output was sent to the military commanders by teleprinter.
All of the Axis powers are being intercepted, their codes are being attacked. The Italians, the Japanese, the Germans, the Hungarians, the Romanians, and they're also intercepting and decrypting neutral traffic. You know, the Vatican.
The Vatican?
Yes. It's a very important place, the Vatican, because it's kind of a crossroads of knowledge and information. And
did the Vatican have an enigma? Or
No, it had its own cipher systems, code books.
And you might think, wait, why were they intercepting the Pope's messages? The Vatican was neutral, Rome was occupied, but the Vatican never was.
There's intelligence about all sorts of things because the Pope is in contact with Mussolini, he's in contact with Hitler, you know. But also, more specifically, there are Catholic reporters providing information about the Holocaust. And that's why the British government and the US government know some of the things they know about what's happening.
Which they can't do anything about because then the Germans will be aware
they do.
that...
People say, they covered it up to protect the secret of the codes. No, they didn't.
I had fallen for a popular myth, one that appears in fiction about Bletchley Park over and over again, that some of their work was wasted because acting on it would reveal that the codes were broken.
That is a much, much rarer occurrence, if at all, than the myth suggests. Most often there are ways of doing things that doesn't reveal that it comes from message traffic.
A lucky spy plane that happens to...
Well, this is the thing, in the Mediterranean, they're breaking Italian codes on a daily basis, and the Italians are trying to supply Rommel in North Africa. So the British are attacking the convoys across the Mediterranean. They're reading the messages, planning those convoys. But what it means they can do is they send reconnaissance aircraft from Malta to a grid square that just happens to have a convoy in it. And the pilot doesn't know that, and the RAF reconnaissance squadron don't know that, and the Italians certainly don't know that. So the Italians just thought we had many more reconnaissance aircraft than we actually had, because they kept turning up.
On the wall in the next room was the answer to my first question. How did thousands of people not give this away? To the point where a lot of the historic site was abandoned and almost derelict decades later. How did Bletchley Park stay secret? 3 reasons. The first is cultural.
In the 1930s, the culture that we have now of the right to know, just didn't exist. If the government didn't tell you something, you just put up with it. I mean, it was a class-riddled society as well. You go, oh, it's not my place to know that, and people didn't bother about it. Secondly, as soon as you have a war going on, people know that stuff has to be secret, and they're much more aware of not asking questions. The country's under existential threat. We could all be bombed, we could all be taken over and forced to speak German. So the threat is real. And so people have a really strong incentive to not ask.
The second reason is that at the time, Bletchley Park did not seem special.
Bletchley Park, as a country house with a fence around it, is by no means unique in the UK. Any National Trust property, any English heritage property you go to will have Trolley Park at War as part of their display, because all of these places were taken over for different tasks. And some of it was stores, some of it was training, some of it was billeting of troops ready for invasion, all sorts. So almost every country house in the country had a fence around it and a soldier on the gate. So Bletchley Park wouldn't have really stood out from that point of view. It would have looked like just another country house, except that it had these slightly peculiar people coming in and out.
Perhaps the most important reason is that when someone came to Bletchley Park, there was a document they had to sign, the Official Secrets Act, the laws that set out the penalties for leaking government information.
This is slightly misunderstood by people because they think by signing it, you're bound by it. That's not true. You're bound by it anyway.
It's a law.
It's a law. If I told you a government secret and you then blabbed it to someone, you could be prosecuted whether or not you'd signed the Official Secrets Act, because just by the nature of the information.
These days, that's not strictly true, particularly if you're not working for the government. You'd need to know something was a secret and know that blabbing it would harm the country. But back then, if you were working at Bletchley Park, it was made clear that leaking anything was a very serious offence.
You also hear stories, although pinning them down exactly is difficult. Veterans talk about, revolvers being placed on the desk and threats of prosecution for treason and all sorts of things being made, and people being told, you can never speak about this, ever, 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 take it to your grave, etc., etc.
They may have taken it to their grave, but the government either didn't or couldn't.
The secret came out because books were published in America and in France that were starting to basically leak it. And so the government decided in 1977 to start releasing documents. The veterans were released from their obligation of secrecy formally by the government in 2009. And a lot of them, even despite that, choose not to talk about it. Or they'll talk about where they lived and who their friends were, but they won't talk about the work. And there was a definite sense among some of the veterans of betrayal, that they kept the secret and the government didn't. And they feel a bit like, I never told my husband, he's now dead, so I kept the secret even from my husband, and now you're blabbing it to the whole world, So it's definitely a mixed feeling about that. But also they have the problem that when the war ends and everybody has a war story, they don't, especially the men. I mean, not so much the women, but the men, certainly.
If their children ask them, Dad, what did you do in the war? Civil servant in the Foreign Office? You might have decrypted the intelligence that helped them storm the beaches at Normandy, but you can't tell anyone that. There's a memorial at Bletchley Park with the inscription, "We also served." And that Official Secrets Act, it's a bit legal and dull, so the folks in charge thought of something more emotional.
They devised a document that they felt was more effective, and one of those documents is on this poster. And this distills what the Official Secrets Act demands into much more powerful language than all the person would understand. Do not talk at meals, do not talk in a transport, do not talk in your billet, do not talk by your own fireside. This one has a phrase in it which I particularly love. It says, if you are indiscreet and tell your own folks, they may see no reason why they should not do likewise. They are not in a position to know the consequences and have received no guidance. Moreover, if one day invasion came, as it perfectly well may, Nazi brutality might stop at nothing to wring from those that you care for the secrets that you would give anything then to have saved them from knowing. Their only safety will lie in their utter ignorance of your work. It's like, if you don't want your granny tortured to death by the Nazis, don't tell her what your job is. It's powerful stuff, isn't it?
Someone in a government department in the 1940s worked very hard on that language, and it clearly paid off.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an exaggeration. Well, it's a slight exaggeration, but it's serious. It rams home the point. And then You know, I hereby promise that no word of mine shall betray, however slightly, the great trust placed in me, and then you sign it.
That is quite a document to sign.
It is. And if you're an 18-year-old Wren who last week was in high school, you know, you're playing with the big boys now.
And for some, it wasn't that threat or that knowledge of the law. It was something much more personal.
There are certain examples of veterans who their concern wasn't necessarily prosecution or anything else. The major pressure was not to let the side down. You don't want to be the one that gives the game away. And if you think many of them had family members, sweethearts, whatever, in the armed forces, you know, if your boyfriend's a pilot, you've got a very strong incentive to keep secrets secret. And so it's one of those questions that I get asked all the time, but the answer is kind of sitting there in plain sight, that actually you have to put your mind in the frame of somebody who is in the 1940s, in the middle of a war. And we're very lucky that most of our later generations have not had that experience. But I'm sure if we were, again, people would knuckle down quite quickly.
Next time, or right now on Nebula, high-tech wheels that creak and groan across the surface of another planet.